This video is going to attempt to review all of option D.3, which is all about human evolution, which covers a bunch of different topics. Okay, D.3.1 through 3 is all about how we determine the ages or relative ages of different fossils using radioisotopes. And there's already another video covering this, so I'll just make this kind of brief. But the first thing you need to be able to do is outline the method for dating rocks and fossils using radioisotopes with reference to carbon-14 and potassium-40. Okay, for this topic, you need to understand these radioisotopes. So the term isotope means that they are elements that are, or different atoms that are the same element, um, but with a different number of neutrons. And because of that fact that they do have the different number of neutrons, it makes these radioisotopes very unstable, meaning that they decay into more stable isotopes. And so to be able to date fossils using these radioisotopes, there's a couple things that we do need to know. First, we need to know here are what you need to know to be able to or date based on radioisotopes. You need to know the proportion of radioisotope radioisotope to normal isotope in living things. Okay. So for carbon-14, it's about one, or how should we write this? 1 carbon-14 to about a trillion carbon-12s in living things. Okay. The reason that this is known is because this is about the proportion of carbon-14 to carbon-12 in the atmosphere. Recall that carbon-14 is formed when nitrogen-14 is converted into radioactive carbon-14 just due to cosmic rays changing the properties of it. And so you can measure the amount of carbon-14 to carbon-12 in the atmosphere, and that should be the same as the amount of carbon-14 to carbon-12 in living things because of plants either taking in carbon as carbon dioxide in photosynthesis or animals eating organic carbon being made by the plants. So once you have this constant rate of proportion, then you would also need to measure the amount of carbon-14 remaining in a fossil. So just by getting the mass of isolating the carbon-14, getting the mass of it, and then by comparing the amount of carbon-14 to carbon-12, you can really get a good estimate of how old it is because you also need to know the decay rate of the radioisotope. Okay, and we'll get into that in a sec about the half-life of carbon-14. Basically, this radioactive isotope decays at a constant rate, and you need to know that rate to be able to figure out how old it is. Okay, and so you know how much there should be if it was still alive, and then you measure how much is still left, and then based on the rate at which decays, you can determine the age of the fossil. And basically, the overall trend is that the less radioisotope remaining, radioisotope is like impossible to spell, just like rocks. Radioisotope remaining, the older the fossil. Okay, and so carbon-14 is typically used to date fossils from things that were once living. Potassium-40 is used to date rocks. Potassium 40 is incorporated for igneous rocks when they are still magma. And then when they form into rocks, the the potassium 40, sorry, is no longer incorporated. So just by the same principle, knowing how much potassium 40 there is to normal potassium, and then measure how much is remaining, and then knowing the decay rate of potassium 40, you can determine how old a rock is. Okay, and the decay rate for potassium 40 is much slower than for carbon 14. Okay. So next, define half-life. And so this is basically the same thing as the decay rate. And really how you define it, it's the amount of time needed for a sample. It could be a sample of anything, but typically we talk about sample of a radioactive isotope or a radioisotope to decay to 50% of the original amount. And this becomes really easy to use in terms of calculating age when you graph it on a decay curve, which is the next assessment statement. So deduce the approximate age of materials based on a simple decay curve for a radioisotope. So for carbon-14, the half-life is about 5,730 years. And so you can graph time versus the percent of radioactivity, which is really the percent of isotope remaining. So for example, if you found a fossil and you measured all the carbon-14 and measured all the rest of the stuff in it, and you found out that it had 40% of the remaining, or carbon-40 that it once had remaining, then we just find 40% on our decay curve and then interpolate the time based on that. And it looks like it's a little bit less than 10,000 years, or a little bit more than one half-life, but less than two, yeah, or kind of halfway. Yeah. So that's all about radio dating, but again, there's other videos that cover that in more depth. Okay. Next, you have to describe the major anatomical features that define humans as primates. So really what a primate is, it's a great ape. And so these are characteristics that make us not only great apes, but also make us human in some respects. Okay. The main ones you'll see all relate to human hands. So we do have opposable thumbs, meaning our thumbs are able to act independently of the rest of our fingers. And that helps us to be able to grasp tools and use tools. Kind of helping along with that, we have finger pads and fingerprints instead of claws, and so that helps us to grasp things and also to climb instead of scratching and clawing away at things. And then our fingers are relatively long and fine, which gives us better motor skills. And so those all kind of relate to the ability to use tools and also the ability to climb. Our shoulder socket is fully rotatable, and that is very helpful for swinging from vine to vine or branch to branch. So as primates, we do spend a time period in our evolution in the treetops. Okay. Other things, we have a large brain and large cranial capacity, and that helps us with our higher order thinking and processing. We have two forward-facing eyes, and that helps us with stereoscopic or 3D vision, which basically is the idea that we are able to see depth, see how far, how close we are relative to something, which again is very helpful for swinging around. And then our bodies are very well adjusted for bipedalism. Our skull to spine attachment allows for upright walking or upright standing, uprightness, and then our legs are relatively long, which allows us for bipedal and allows for ease of bipedal movement. Okay. And so these are the main traits that define us as primates. Next, outline the trends illustrated by the fossils of the different hominid species. So you guys should have probably more information about this, so I'll run through it quickly. So the first and most primitive hominid species that you need to know is Ardipithecus ramidus. It exists about 5.5 to 4.4 million years ago. That's what MYA means. And it's typically found in Ethiopia or in that general area. They actually don't have very many fossils of this hominid species. Most are just based on teeth. But from that, they kind of hypothesize that these are very similar to modern chimps. Okay? The next species is Australopithecus afarensis. So this hominid species existed between 4 and 2.5 million years ago, mostly found in Eastern Africa. This is the Lucy species that has been found in recent years. Defining traits, it has a larger lower jaw, which is missing in this fossil, but it does have a jaw and mouth that kind of projects outwards, and then it does have large molars, and it has a relatively small cranial capacity between 380 and 430 cubic centimeters. Next is Australopithecus africanus, which existed now just 3 to 2.5 million years ago, and this one was found more in southern Africa. So it also has a thicker jaw that still does project out. It does still have larger molars, and then the cranial capacity is slightly larger, but not a huge significant jump from the previous species. Next, we get into the next clade or next genus, Homo. So first you have Homo habilis, which existed between 2.4 to 1.6 million years ago in both Eastern and Southern Africa. This is colloquially known as handyman. And what you start to see is that the face starts to flatten out so that the jaw doesn't stick out as much. The back of the skull also kind of starts to round out and be less flat, as you see in earlier Australopithecus fossils. So it's got a flatter face. It still has large molars though. And then you do see a little bit of a jump in cranial capacity up to 600 cubic centimeters. And then this fossil, we do have evidence that they use simple tools and we're also able to control fire. Okay. Next, you have Homo erectus, which existed between 1.8 million years to 100,000 years ago. And this fossil was found more now in Europe, Asia, and Africa. So again, you see the jaw starting to get smaller, the forehead starting to recede a little bit more so that you have more skull devoted to the forehead. You have still large brow bridges, the bones where the eyebrows would form, and then the molars are starting to get smaller now. And then here you see a big jump in cranial capacity up to 1,000 cubic centimeters. Next, you have Homo neanderthalensis, which existed between 200,000 to 30,000 years ago in Europe and Western Asia as well. This is generally the Neanderthal man, and again, many of the trends continue. The jaw is getting smaller and smaller. The forehead is starting to form a little bit more, although it's still pretty small. The brow bridges above the eye bones are still pretty small, or still there, but are getting smaller, and then the molars are smaller as well. And then here you also have another large jump in cranial capacity. Homo neanderthalensis actually has the largest cranial capacity for hominids that we know of at 1,600 cc's. Okay. And then last, we have primitive humans or Homo sapiens. They've been found about 140,000 years ago in different places. Now we start to see the larger forehead starting to form. The brow ridges, the bones on top of the eye sockets, are now starting to completely go away. The face is generally pretty flat, and then we have much smaller molars and a small jaw still. And then we have the most evidence of them using different tools, different art and customs and things like that. And then they do have a slightly smaller cranial capacity than Neanderthal man. But the general trends that you see is that cranial capacity increases or gets larger over time. You have jaws getting smaller over time, and also teeth getting smaller over time. And that's kind of a consequence of the cranial capacity increasing in size. It's pushing out space for jaws and teeth. You generally see a flattening of the face from the most primitive hominids to the most modern ones. You see a formation of the forehead instead of just running straight from the face to the top of the skull. And also the loss of the brow ridges, the bones right underneath your eyebrows. And then in general, towards the back and the top of the skull, you see a rounding of that part, so the rounding of the top and back of skull, as compared to primitive hominid species, and also of some of the modern great apes. We kind of see that trend as well. Okay, but again, you guys should have more information about that. Okay. D.3.6 state that at various stages in hominid evolution, several species may have coexisted. So here's just a general timeline showing some of the information from the previous page of when these fossils were known, or when these species were known to exist. So many of these did exist or during the same time period. The Australopithecus species, although they do overlap for a little bit, since there are so few species, it's not likely that these two ever really interacted, although it's possible that they could have. But you do have more interaction with some of the later Homo species, specifically Homo sapiens and Homo neanderthalensis. These guys were known to interact because they did coexist at the same time and the same place. And also some of the probably transitional species at this time were able to interact as well. So some of the consequences of either these species interacting or existing at the same time is, one, being able to share some parts of their cultural evolution, which can be passed on within a generation, but also that there's potential that some species were able to interbreed at times or during certain instances, which did allow some gene pools to mix. But scientists are very unsure about that. And that kind of leads into D.3.7, discuss the incompleteness of the fossil record and the resulting uncertainties about human evolution. A good analogy that the book makes to think about this is like trying to analyze a jigsaw puzzle while you're still missing many of the pieces. Okay? So even though we do have many fossils, we don't have fossils that represent the entirety of human and hominid evolution. And so we can try to draw a picture and make hypotheses based on the evidence that we do have. But since we don't have all the evidence, we can't ever be completely sure about that. And there's many different reasons why we don't have fossils for all the different hominid species. One, fossilization is kind of a rare event. Many conditions must be met for something to be fossilized and be preserved. And so we don't have fossils for every single thing that once was living. Also, the fossils that do exist must be accessible. And so, if there's some kind of physical or geographical barrier, we might not be able to get to the fossils. But also, if there's like a legal or national barrier, or if it's protected in some kind of conservation area, we might not be able to get to those fossils either. And then some fossils or some species are more common than others, just because those species were, just more successful, and so there were more of them than others. And so, we don't really have a good representation of all the different possible hominid species that could have survived. Okay, so even though we do make this timeline, we're not completely certain about those things. Okay. Next, discuss the correlation between the change in diet and increase in brain size during hominid evolution. So the change in diet is basically a diet richer in proteins, as correlating with hominid evolution over time. So this is a positive correlation. We do see as brain size is increasing, we see a diet richer in proteins. Most of the source of many of these proteins is through meat. Okay. And then other correlations that are seen during this time more sophisticated tools. And so what this leads to is better efficiency in hunting, um, such as being able to hunt larger game or being able to kill them more easily with better tools. We also see at this time correlating more social norms with hunting, just because as a group it's better to hunt as a group than as an individual, because you're not always guaranteed to catch something, but as a group you increase your chances of catching something. So that has also been correlated with brain size during hominid evolution, and also the emergence of cooking, which allows us to which basically allows easier digestion of food, and also allows us to just eat more types of foods, because cooking allows us to eat things that previously were not able to be eaten. So allows easier digestion slash wider variety of foods that could potentially be eaten. Okay. And so generally, we see these things correlated, and they're kind of all correlated with general intelligence that we see during hominid evolution. It's not to say one causes the other, or not necessarily, but you can kind of think of these things both affecting each other and being affected by the relative intelligence of hominids during their evolution. Okay. Okay. Next, we have to distinguish between genetic and cultural evolution. That was a terrible line. So genetic evolution, this is controlled by our genetics, obviously. So controlled by our heritable traits in DNA. This is based on Darwin's idea of natural selection. Basically, the individuals born with the best traits or traits most favorable in their environment will survive the best and pass them on. And examples of genetic evolution is typically with body morphology, or just the shape and the overall formation of different hominid bodies, and just other, mainly just physical characteristics. Also, brain size and cranial capacity is controlled by genetic evolution, because that is determined by our genetics. Cultural evolution is a little bit different. Cultural evolution deals with acquired knowledge, and basically just the knowledge that is built up within a particular culture, in this case the culture of hominids and humans. Examples of these are language, technology and tools, art and medicine and things like that, and also just customs and social norms, which can be passed on. And so these are a little bit different than cultural evolution, obviously. Cultural evolution can be much faster. This can occur within a single generation, whereas genetic evolution and natural selection can take long generations and long periods of times for this to occur. But cultural evolution can be passed on, just from father to son, or from one family to the next, within a generation. And also, being that this is not controlled by genetics, it's just an acquired trait. And so instead of following Darwin's natural selection, this actually follows the principles of Lamarck, which is basically that an individual can acquire a trait and then pass it on to his offspring. So in this case, an individual can acquire language and acquire technology or art and then pass that on to an offspring, which can then acquire that trait as well, which is obviously much different than genetic evolution. Okay. Finally, discuss the relative importance of genetic and cultural evolution in the recent evolution of humans. So the main idea here is that both genetic and cultural evolution have to be in some ways beneficial to the survivability and the fitness of humans. So first, genetic evolution is needed to lead to cultural evolution, just because, as we talked about previously, we do need the evolution of the brain and the complexity of the brain first before we can develop culture. Brain leads to cultural development. Okay. And also just our coordination in being able to use the tools that are developed in cultural evolution are helpful. But then cultural evolution develops cultural development of tools, technology, medicines, cooking and diet, things like that, which are all very helpful to human evolution. And cultural evolution also allows for faster evolution and faster solutions to problems that are occurring. So instead of relying on genetic evolution, which takes many generations to see any noticeable changes, cultural evolution can be much faster, and that's what we really see today. Because genetically, we have not really evolved much since the early Homo sapiens, maybe just a little bit, but culturally, obviously, we're much different. Okay, but these last couple ideas, these are really just thinking points that you need to think about. So really think about what genetic evolution versus cultural evolution really means. And that's what you'll kind of have to address on the quiz and the test. Right? So I hope this was helpful. Sorry this was such a long set of notes in a long video.